I would like to welcome Professor Richard Eaton, the author of the groundbreaking book, India in the Persianate Age. He will discuss today with Professors Alka Patel and Roy Fischel. I would also like to welcome the many followers of our webinars. It is wonderful to see many returns and others who join us for the first time. It is truly pleasing that the webinars the Deccan Heritage Foundation has organized in collaboration with the foundation of His Highness Srikantadatta Narasimharaja Wadiyar of Mysore and the Center for Islamic Studies, Cambridge University, have such a multinational following with a substantial Indian presence. I would also like to thank Neil Cunningham from Cambridge University for his help and continued support. Our Indian team as well, and especially Srikantadatta, the administrator of the Deccan Heritage Foundation India, has also been a constant support. Our thanks also go to Nandini Priya and Nidhi Sa for the poster of our webinars From Malabar to Coromandel. Our collaboration with Her Highness Dr. Pramod Devi Wadiyar was gratifying, while the knowledge and understanding of Deccan's complex cultural history of Dr. Vivek Gupta from the Center of Islamic Studies, Cambridge University, was rewarding. I will not introduce the book, but let me say a few words about our author. His primary interest is in the social and cultural history of pre-modern India. He is one of the most respected scholars in the field of Deccani studies, as well as on the social impact of Sufism, not only in the Deccan, but also in Bengal. In the book, he co-authored with Philip Waggoner, they explore the importance of memory in Deccani visual art, and in particular architecture, a theme that has suggested new modes of intercultural communications. Professor Alka Patel is Associate Professor in the Department of Art History and in the PhD program for Visual Studies at the University of California, at the University of Chicago, at the University of California, Irvine. Her research has focused on South Asia and its connections with Iran and Central Asia, including overland and Indian Ocean maritime networks, including mercantile networks and architectural patronage in 18th and 19th century South Asia. Roy Fischel, the other discussant, is a lecturer in the history of South Asia at SOAS University of London. He completed his PhD at the University of Chicago in 2012. His work focuses on state, society, ideology, and identity, and the intersection between them in early modern South Asia and the Muslim world. His first monograph, Local States in an Imperial World Identity, Society and Politics in the Early Modern Deccan, was recently published by Edinburgh University Press and the Royal Asiatic Society. His current work examines kingship, sovereignty, and historiography in Bijapur between the Persianate, Islamic, and Indic worlds. So I don't want to take any more of your time. Let me say welcome to all of you. And I would like now Professor Richard Eaton to start with his presentation. Thank you, Richard.
Well, thank you so much, Helen. I must say it's a great pleasure and indeed an honor to take part in this series that you have organized. What I want to do now is start my share screen, if I could do that. I think we're all there. Yes. And I thought what I would do is really talk about my book, how I got the idea to write this book, what were the influences, and in particular, what this tells us about the Deccan Plateau, since that, after all, is our focus in this series. And I would say that there are roughly 2 or 3 major influences or ideas that caused me to write this book in the way I did after I was commissioned by Penguin to undertake a textbook on this period, roughly 1000 to the 18th century. And the first was the way in which the advent of Turco-Persian rule in India has been traditionally characterized. Images like this modern print depict the Muslim conquest of India as we see, very violent. And I contrast that in the very beginning of my book with the way in which the Spanish conquest of America is typically portrayed. And the difference between the two, it seems to me, is quite obvious. You see Christopher Columbus here with a very large cross, clearly indicating the religious dimension of the project, but also, of course, the American Indians rather humbly presenting their gifts to Columbus, and this Spanish soldier rather helpfully showing an Indian what a sword is. It's quite an extraordinary contrast between these two great historical encounters. I especially draw attention to the fact that in the one case, religion is foregrounded. It's always, or conventionally understood as a Muslim conquest of India, not a Turkish conquest, as opposed to the Spanish conquest, not a Christian conquest of America. This is notwithstanding the fact that the most typical term that was used to describe the Muslims who arrived in the 13th century was Turishka, or Turkish. So that was one of the first seminal points that kind of inspired me to take a different course rather than privileging religion, as most books typically do in covering this long period from 1000 to 1800. A second influence takes us right down to the modern day. When Prime Minister Modi came to power, among other things, he gave this speech here, you see, where he described the period of Indian history that I specialize on in terms of 1200 years of slavery. Baraso Salki Gulami. That itself is extraordinary. And it tells us, of course, it speaks directly to what we all know is happening today, the politicization of religion and the use of religion as a political force by the regime. But what also I want to comment on in Prime Minister Modi's remark is that when he was making this statement, quite ironically, 7 out of 28 of the words, Hindi words you see here, are Arabo-Persian, fully a quarter of them. And that's not only ironic, but it speaks directly to the fact that during the very period that he's calling slavery was also a time when clearly Persian language and Persian influence had been infiltrating India. And that was a second influence on this. A third one was the publication of Shelley Pollack's book, The Language of the Gods in the World of Men, published about 10 years back, in which he elaborated this notion of a Sanskrit cosmopolis, an idea that not only Sanskrit language, but Sanskrit literature diffused across a great swathe of territory extending all the way from eastern Afghanistan, where Kandahar, after all, is a Sanskrit word, all the way to Singapore and beyond, for that matter, in Southeast Asia, where he describes a tradition that's not only trans-regional, but prestigious, characterized by a canon of literature, of both epic poetry and discursive prose. But above all, this Sanskrit cosmopolis elaborated a sense of moral and social order that was considered to be normative for many peoples, and it existed above, as it were, the vernacular world of ordinary regional cultures. And finally, religion was not at all ignored in the Sanskrit cosmopolis. Think of, after all, both Buddhist and Hindu traditions diffusing into Southeast Asia, but nor was it privileged. And that is also a key point. And so when I considered that book, I thought about almost a perfect analog with the case of Persian, extending from the Balkans in the west all the way through Bengal to Burma in the east, where you have a very similar tradition that's trans-regional, it's prestigious, it has a canon of literature that's both epic poetry and discursive prose, and above all, elaborating an understanding of moral and social order. And both these traditions not only played dominant roles in Southern Asia, but most importantly, they overlapped in India. And it was this overlapping of the earlier Sanskrit with the later Persian traditions, which I decided to use as the underlying conceptual framework of my book. Because it's only in South Asia where you have these two traditions interacting with each other in a fascinating way, in many different ways over time. And what enables these two traditions to really work is an infrastructure of networks. And there's been a great deal of discussion in many disciplines in the last 10 years about network theory, where you have this idea of dots and lines. In this case, it's graphically depicted where a dot might refer to a temple, a mata, a royal court, a Sufi khanga, maybe a madrasa, whereas the lines refer to the volume and intensity of movement of either texts or people between these points. And obviously, this has nothing to do with states or political systems. Indeed, it transcends the boundaries of states. So that idea of network theory seemed to be a very fruitful one that I was able to use at the same time. So going back to this idea of the overlapping of the Persian and Sanskrit, which is the underlying argument of my book, I start with the idea that these traditions, at least when they first encountered each other, were understood in terms of opposition. This is the first chapter of Biruni's Kitab al-Hind, his Book of India, in which he elaborates the idea that these Indians are different from us in every respect. He talks about language, he talks about religion, and the use of the word lecha to describe these impure foreigners, referring to himself, of course. And he talks about, in the third place, all manners and usages, they differ from us to such a degree as to frighten their children with our dress and our ways and customs. I love that little last touch about using foreigners to frighten their children. But that underlies how different these two worlds were understood, at least at the early decades or centuries of their encounter. But what happens over time is that these traditions become increasingly interwoven. There is cross-fertilization, there's mutual borrowing that we can see illustrated in many ways. For example, in the Persian world, the idea of justice, or adalat, adl, is absolutely central. It's not unique to the Persian by any means. It's inherited by the Persian Empire and diffused, throughout the Persian world. But this idea is illustrated rather dramatically by this coin by Sultan Iltutmish, where simply the word adl alone is, or justice, is depicted on one side of his coins. And what's interesting is that this idea also comes through in the so-called mirrors for princes literature, where justice seems to be the kingpin or the linchpin of the whole system. Ibn Balkhi was one of many authors of this genre of Persian literature, or the so-called mirrors for princes. In his Farsnama, he says, there's no kingdom without an army, no army without wealth, no wealth without material prosperity, and no prosperity without justice. You notice that there's no mention of God. Religion is simply taken out of this formula of a political economy and a moral economy spinning around justice. Well, not long after him, in the 12th, possibly the 13th century, in the Deccan, far away from the Delhi Sultanate, but roughly contemporary with Iltutmish when he's issuing those coins, we find a very similar, strikingly similar formulation by a Telugu poet, Badina, to acquire wealth, make the people prosper. To make people prosper, justice is the means. O Kirti Narayana, they say that justice is the treasury of kings. So we have, in other words, an ideology which is already diffused, quite irrespective of politics or of political power, all the way, in this case, down to the Deccan Plateau, to the Kakatiya dynasty in Andhra. The idea of the Sultan also diffuses southward. The founders of Vijayanagara, after all, describe themselves as this term where the word Sultan has been indigenized into Telugu and Kannada, both, the Hindu Raya Suratrana, or the Sultan of Indian kings, and ultimately Haridhara himself simply describes himself as Suratrala, Sultan alone. So that this indigenization of the word, as well as the idea, is part of this process of increasing mutual interaction and cross-fertilization that we can see depicted in so many ways. Here, for example, is one of the many images that appears in the Nujum al-Ulum, famous text written by Ali Adil Shah of Bijapur, in which we see depicted here these Turkish warriors wearing headgear called kula. And that same headgear is found in Vijayanagara paintings here at Lapakshi, as well as not just the headgear, but also the tunics seem to be derived from Iranian or at least Middle Eastern origins. We find even Krishnaraya himself, one of the most prominent kings of Vijayanagara, depicted here in Raichur shortly after he conquered this fort from Bijapur. You have this frieze of images depicting the Ramayana epic, but included in that is an image of Krishnaraya himself wearing a kula, or as it's been indigenized in the Telugu language, kulai. And I want to just remark here that the indigenization of language, as I first illustrated with Prime Minister Modi, is something that had been going on across South Asia and is only one dimension of this increasing diffusion of Persian culture into South Asia. And of course, Turkish soldiers were, as we all know, were assimilated into the armies of Vijayanagara, and not surprisingly, they appear, or figures that appear to be Turkish soldiers appear on temples in metropolitan Bijapur, in Vijayanagara. And in architecture, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I know this is something that's been well rehearsed by many of you, but just to point out some of the more dramatic points here, we see in the heart of Vijayanagara, in the so-called royal center anyway, the use of the kind of vaulting techniques and domes and arches and so forth that is identified as of course arcuated architecture, so-called Muslim architecture. I put that in scare quotes because obviously it's not Islamic. It's really Persianate and has been freely assimilated by Vijayanagara, both in this image on the upper left as well as in the gateway to the right, a good example of that. But at the same time, and fascinatingly, only a mile or so away from the above image, you have this mosque in trivieted form. And these two images, it seems to me, really show the lie to any notion of Islamic architecture or Hindu architecture, words that have been used for generations by scholars. At the same time, the Vijayanagara is assimilating forms and ideas inherited from ancient Persia. The idea of a 100-column hall, something that comes, it's transmitted, of course, with many intermediaries, but can be traced all the way back to the 6th century BC in Persepolis. Also, Vijayanagara is drawing upon yet another imperial tradition closer to home, and that is the Chalukya dynasty that had at one time extended over virtually the entire Deccan Plateau. And Phil Wagner and I have argued that empire really became the model, the template for informing state builders on both sides of the Krishna River. To the south, Vijayanagara, probably under Ramaraya in the early 16th century, has simply reassembled an entire, or disassembled, a Chalukya stepped tank from some unknown site and reassembled it in the very heart of the royal center of the capital. Similarly, in the mandapa facing the very important Virupaksha temple, right by the banks of the river, the Tungabhadra River, they have included Chalukya columns, not on the upper floor, which is not as visible, and there you simply see above the local stone being used, but rather on the lower floor where it can be kind of shown off or displayed as connecting the state of Vijayanagara with the earlier Chalukya dynasty. In Bijapur, Ali I is doing the same thing by taking such columns and putting them in his own gateway to the citadel. The most important gateway to the city was covered with these kinds of columns. And indeed, one of the southern gateways of the city, he takes a whole Makaratorana, Chalukya, and places that above that that portal going into the outer walls of the city. So we see, in other words, on both sides of the Krishna, this leaning upon Chalukya art. One last example, in Kalyana Fort, under Ibrahim II in 1592, we have this courtyard of the Raj Mahal, where you have a number of openings. The one to the north, where the area you see, you go into a typical Persianate kind of palace room, but you go back out into the other opening to the left on the western side, and it takes you to an in situ Chalukya temple, which has never been moved. It was always there. Indeed, the whole palace was built around this particular Chalukya temple. And then finally, if we come to material culture, and I want to add here that Phil Wagner is doing very exciting work on this topic as well, where he traces the use of coinage across time. And here you have, for example, the golden pagoda or hon used by Krishnaraya, early 16th century, itself based on again, a Chalukya coin dating 400 years or so earlier. And in weight and in fineness, it is the same rate, the same standard, which has been used for hundreds of years in the Deccan. And it's used not only in Vijayanagara, but is also preferred in Bijapur and Golconda to the north. In other words, at the same time that the sultans were minting silver coinage, the people were preferring to use this golden coin of the south, which was already familiar to them. Indeed, it got to such a point that the Sultan himself, Sultan Muhammad al-Shah, had to issue coins in exactly the same weight and the same fineness, 3.4 ounce and 89% gold. In other words, to pass as a legitimate coinage, even the sultans of the northern Deccan had to use the same thing. So in other words, there's an extraordinary degree of continuity and cross-fertilization here seen in material culture. So all this, to kind of wrap this up, I use to kind of argue that we've come a very long ways from al-Biruni in the early 11th century, where he saw nothing but difference. As we move from the 13th all the way down to the 17th and 18th centuries, we see this increasing cross-fertilization, which my book argues happens all over South Asia. What I've tried to talk about this morning is really confined to the Deccan Plateau, since that's our focus. But I'll simply say that this process of fertilization is most clearly seen along the migration corridors as Turkish and Persian peoples migrated from Central Asia into Lahore and down to Delhi, toward Bengal or southwest to Gujarat and into the Deccan. That's where we see this kind of cross-fertilization happening most vigorously and clearly. When we come to Bengal or Malabar, areas where this migration corridor was weaker, where there's less influence of direct migration, we see another dynamic which also has to, I think, needs to be discussed here, and that is the way in which both the Sanskrit and the Persian worlds were interacting with their respective vernacular cultures. In other words, the story of Indian history that I try to cover is not only that of interaction between these two trans-regional prestigious cultures, the Sanskrit and the Persian, but it's also the way in which each of them interacted with vernacular culture. And that's something that we see in many ways. One of the most dramatic and visual ways of looking at this is simply looking at how mosques and temples appear in these regions that are kind of beyond that central corridor that I spoke of. In Malabar, to the left, you see both temples and mosques borrowing from or taking from a more a regional vocabulary, architectural vocabulary, and the same thing in Bengal, where we have again this temple in Vishnupur and this mosque in Mymensingh, where you have both of them with a curved cornice, the modified domes, the articulated facade of terracotta work, and so forth. And in literature, the same thing happens, that just as Sanskrit was serving as a model for Bengali prose when it emerges in the 15th century, or Telugu, or Kannada, or Hindi, so also Persian serves as a model for the emergence of Deccan literature, and obviously, of course, Urdu, when it finally appears toward the very end of the story. So I guess I want to close with this idea then of this overall story of an increasing degree of mutual interaction, mutual interpenetration of these two trans-regional cultures, but always bearing in mind that at the same time, they are also interacting with their respective regions. And that's kind of a leitmotif as well of the book. And then finally, in closing, before we get to our discussion this morning, I felt it was very important in my book not to understand religious or social communities as frozen in time or as kind of God-given entities, but rather to see them as evolving and emerging over time, and to try to historicize communities which are oftentimes seen as kind of eternal. So 5 of the 8 chapters explores the identity or the emergence of new groups: Rajputs, Sikhs, Marathas, and Muslims primarily. And with that, Helen, I think I am going to bring this to a close and open it back up to you or the other speakers, perhaps.
So,
whatever plan here.
Yeah, thank you, Dick, for that wonderful synopsis of your book. It's really a difficult task to summarize something this large in that amount of time. But now we will turn over the floor to Professor Patel, who will provide some comments and discussion. So Professor Patel, can you share your screen? Yeah?
Yes. Thank you for this. Let me share my screen. Yes, visible, all good?
Yep.
Okay, great. Again, let me please thank, as Dick Eaton did, Helen and Vivek and the entire Deccan Heritage Foundation for this opportunity. And it's a wonderful series. We were discussing the power of these conversations, particularly in these difficult times, but I think you're actually forging a new path, and I hope these conversations will be never ending. So thank you for initiating this and for having me be a part of it. So it would not be an overstatement to say that Dick's book really will be fundamental, certainly, to all of our teaching in the foreseeable future, and also for much of our thinking. And it's really an honor to respond to this gigantic work. I mean, goodness gracious, Dick, that's many pages of great information and thinking. So rather than doing an overly scripted presentation, I actually wanted to propose some points for thinking and discussion. And whoops, I seem unable to, there we go. And Dick, coincidentally, has actually touched upon already and introduced, shall we say, many of the things that I thought might be really powerful fruit for discussion. I'm reminded, particularly after Dick's introduction or overview of his book, of Geraldine Hang's article from 2011, wherein she, for those of you who may have sort of forgotten it because it is 9 years ago, but it was an interesting and I think influential intervention in that she really tried to situate race as something that can be discussed in pre-modern times. And of course, much of her scholarly archive in the broadest sense had to do with the European or the Occidental Middle Ages or the medieval period. But there really was a lot to be gleaned from this intervention in that she talked about religion as something of a paramount source of authority in, again, the European Middle Ages, functioning both socioculturally and biopolitically. And I've found this article to be thought-provoking. And in fact, I have gleaned some of these quotes from it just for the audience also to think about and hopefully to respond to. Also because while it was an influential contribution, I wonder if in the work that Dick has done and all of us as we continue to do, if there isn't actually some room for maneuver and some opening up of this discussion, because while one appreciates this application of something like race as at least an entree to talk about pre-modern human relations, on the other hand, we are also thinking about the fact that even today, religion continues to be one of these powerful identifying markers. So is this intervention by Hang actually doing essentially a service or a disservice to our discussions of what might be seen as a past phenomenon in the Occidental sense or the lens, when actually it is very much an active engagement today. And then at the very end, of course, Dick touched upon the identifications of groups and clarified also that these are evolving and ever-changing identifications. I just wanted to propose or put out there one kind of specific definition that has been attempted by Smith, or was attempted in 1999 and was quoted as such in the monograph archaeologically addressing the Ghurids of Afghanistan, a work that came out in 2018. So here is the quote. And I guess the question that would come up for me is precisely because of the ever-changing nature of ethnese, of self-identifications and identifications of others or by others of groups of people. How important is it, or is it important to get these terms quote unquote right? And I guess this issue really came up in the earliest pages of Dick's book for me, because technically speaking, despite the fact that the Indic sources, largely inscriptional and some textual, refer to this new series of protagonists, shall we say, initially in the North Indian plains as Turushkas. In fact, they were really a mixed bag, ethnically speaking. The Shansabanis, or the Ghurids as they're commonly known, were not Turks themselves, even though they relied upon the Turkic military manpower, and that also specifically from a certain point on. So it's interesting that the term Turushkas actually might have been an inherited term that historically had been applied perhaps more accurately to the Ghaznavids because they were ethnically Turkish, though again, one asks how much of a defining identifier was that because the Ghaznavids had been Turkish ghulams who had been brought up very much in a courtly Persianate ethos. So even though they certainly might have retained memories of very, very early stages of life, the whole point was to deracinate that military ghulam from any ties of kinship and regional or physical geographical belonging, and incorporate them into really a Persianate courtly culture, and also to make them very specifically loyal to their masters. So the issues of ethne, while for historians are very much there, I think it's important to think about how they play out in real life and real time. Again, proposing this as a point of discussion if it's of interest for the other attendees. Also, I was fascinated, and thank you, Dick, for actually attempting to redesign the terms of discussion. So I appreciate very much this de-religionization, shall we say, and perhaps attempting a much more neutral set of terms for discussing this encounter of different linguistic and cultural worlds, so the Persian and Sanskrit worlds, as opposed to the kind of very not always productive Hindu and Muslim. But the one thing that I think encompasses the entire book going into the 18th century are these notions of North and South, the Uttara and Dakshina, as they're manifested in both the Persian as well as the Sanskritic epistemologies in the broadest sense. You yourself very much, and being a historian of material culture, you know, I think better with visuals and with slides. So these might seem gratuitous, but I wanted to offer them nonetheless as perhaps, as Kumaraswamy would say, supports of contemplation. But the temple complex very much was this transplantation, for lack of a better term, of these cosmic geographies that, you know, realistically and accurately speaking, were located in the north. So I find that idea of transplanting Meru and Kailash and the Ganga itself into the south as really a very rich process, and something that needs to be discussed, certainly in a loosely speaking Sanskritic epistemology, and eventually also is very powerful in the Persianate epistemology. Whoops, I apologize. I don't know why we're going backwards. There we go. So, as is well known, in the wake of the Shansab or the Ghurids, a series of newcomers actually infiltrated into the North Indian plains and really set up these extremely influential political formations that eventually, as Dick also described, through the pathways or corridors of migration, I think was the phrase you used, also went into the Dakshina regions of the subcontinent. And, oh God, don't do this to me. So eventually we have the fragmentation of multiple states, shall we say, centered, or at least kind of located in the broadest sense at these various points upon the geography. And with the coming of the Mughals, we see that many of those political formations, particularly in the Deccan, continue to be really fighting off the yoke of this behemoth in the north for at least a century, into some of them the late 17th century. So I think we have this juxtaposition of these northern, at least initially, powers that are trying to infiltrate into the South. And this dialogue or this juxtaposition of Uttara and Dakshina also goes into the later periods. I mean, arguably, one could say that really the Mughal Empire began to unravel precisely when it gained some success in the southern, or at least the Deccan regions and beyond, in the 17th century. So I'm curious to think more and hear thoughts about this dialogue and sometimes even competitive juxtaposition between the North and the South in both the Sanskritic as well as the Persianate epistemologies. Okay.
Thank you, Alka, for that wonderfully synthetic analysis of this book. Dick, would you like to respond now, or would you like to hear from Roy first?
Well, I can quickly say a few things, right? Okay. Very quickly. As to race, you know, that's such a contested, vexed, if not toxic word in today's academic discourse, not to mention non-academic discourse. And we are repeatedly reminded that the whole idea of race is a socially constructed category. That's almost a mantra that we recite in classrooms. Nothing quite like that existed. Well, I guess I want to come to my major point on this, Alka, and that is that I think we really have to take seriously the terms that the people themselves are using, the contemporary terms, the emic terms, and try to flesh out what they mean by that, rather than imposing such a powerful 19th century, 20th century category on them. So to your question of whether it's more service or a disservice, I think that I would come down on the disservice side. But I really like your discussion of North and South as a way of thinking about Indian history in general, including getting the whole subcontinent on this. And yes, there's no doubt, I fully agree with you that there is a love-hate thing going on between the North and the South. I mean, the Cholas want to import Northern culture right down into the Chola country. And of course, the Deccanese under the Sultanas are trying to keep the Mughals out. And the irony is that the Mughal Empire, as you rightly point out, eventually does collapse, in large part precisely because of its attempt to swallow more than it can chew. So I really like that idea of North and South as a handle, as another handle of thinking about, you know, South Asian history as a whole, and very fruitful possibility. Thank you.
May I? Yes, thanks for that, Dick. In fact, you know, I brought up Geraldine Hang's article because I actually wonder if, just as a historiographical comment, if, you know, it's considered to be a very powerful intervention in the study of medieval Europe, but is it really useful? That's ultimately the question. As some kind of a, you know, there's always this power differential, right, in our departments, in the world at large, between the Western historiographical traditions and the non-Western ones. So while Hang was attempting to redeem the Middle Ages as a part of historical time, really, it ends up being almost an implicit idea of that teleological progression of leaving religion behind as a mark of progress and modernity, because that actually is very much alive and well and deeply embedded in self-identifications as well as identifications of each other in many parts of the world, not just South Asia. So I guess it was more of an oblique interrogation, and not so oblique, of really the value of hang. I mean, we're striving for forcing something to become cosmopolitan when it is actually inherently provincial. I mean, these kinds of interventions emerge from a specific place and time. And while the idea is that they might be applicable globally, in fact, there are historical specificities that really, I think, should give us a lot of pause and make us very cautious.
Yeah.
Absolute silence.
Thank you, Alka. No, that's incredibly valuable, and it's something for us to think about. And I think it's actually a great segue to Roy's work, who's also thought a bit about identities in his work. So Roy, go ahead.
Thank you, Vivek. So first, let me echo Alka's point about how wonderful this opportunity is for us to have this conversation between California and England and well, California, Arizona, England, and India, I guess, and elsewhere. So this is just terrific and really enriches the last miserable year that we all had. And in particular, I want to thank Helen for inviting me to respond to this wonderful book. I read it with so much excitement. It is just, it adds so much for the general overview of this long period, exactly in this contested period, as Richard has presented at the beginning of the talk. And it really adds so many layers and textures to this whole concept. So it's, of course, as been noted before, quite difficult to talk about all aspects of a 400-page long book that covers almost 8 centuries over a subcontinent in which a quarter of the human race lives. But I want to highlight just a few points that really attracted my attention here, among many. I want to share a few thoughts that I had, and apologies for no presentation. Guess that I'm less visually inclined than my colleagues here. Before posing a few more direct questions to Richard and to open another way of for our discussion here. So first of all, or first point, and I think that it resonates very well with the discussion that we just had between Richard and Alka, is the idea of the diversity of historical approaches which are used in the book. So unlike many other books that try to cover such a long period, it is far from being any kind of simple linear telling of dynasties, but the turns into different fields of history here, I think adds to so much to our understanding. For example, we have the discussion that comes time and again about military history. Now, I wanted to pick up this one in particular because it's, once again, it resonates the problem that we have with concepts which are presented as universal or cosmopolitan, but they are very much time and place related. And that's, of course, I mean, the debate about the military revolution, which, as Richard has demonstrated so convincingly, the way that it was conceived and presented was, it was a European thing, and whether we have a military revolution has been so many times associated with whether it followed the European path or not. And here we have a case in which a region followed a completely different path, and yet the results, or at least the motivations, the process is very similar, with good results for the locality. So I think that even when we are looking at things which are not as contested as concept of race or ethnicity, we have a very similar issue that Richard did so convincingly, is just reopening the discussion to something that might offer a path towards truly universal categories and truly universal ways to look at those things, exactly because it did not come from Europe and applied elsewhere. The same way I think it goes regarding the discussions of conversion. The concept of conversion, as discussed in the case of Punjab and Bengal, is very different to the notion of conversion that most people in the West will have today, in itself a product of 19th century missionary activity. The idea that conversion is a choice of one person seeing the light or looking for some kind of profit or benefit, and to turn it into the idea that conversion is actually can be seen in certain places and certain times as a centuries long, not anyone's choice in particular, and trying to think about conversion as a category using this will do much more of universalizing these kind of concepts than anything else. I saw it in my own research, the whole concept, and Alka, we discussed this issue, the concept of what is the early modern empire. From the works I've seen, those who promote the idea of Eurasian empire are historians of Asia. There are Ottomanists, there are historians of India, there are historians of China, or those who work on European empires in Asia. For example, the work of Sanjay Subramaniam on the Indian Ocean. But those who look at the Habsburgs or England, early modern England, do not care about universality of concept of early modernity. To them, it's European. And this is something that I really think that this work really offers great advantage towards truly, let me use the buzzword which is very common now at British universities, decolonizing the discourse in actual real terms. Now, from that, I want to get to the second point that is also more related to my own research, is the tensions that we can recognize within these processes that Richard talked about also in his presentation so clearly. And that's this idea that it's not only between two cosmopolitans or between cosmopolitan and vernacular, but there is an underlying theme that I think was very much active quite a long time in South Asian history, is kind of built-in tension between, let's say, centrifugal powers or some kinds of towards unity and those towards regionalism. This is highlighted very well by Pollock's idea of the cosmopolitan versus the vernacular. It is also politically very clear in the case of the Persianate world. And in the case of Sanskrit, it might be a bit less political, but it shows that it also has a very clear cultural element of this kind of tension. And I think that this book does a brilliant job in exactly negotiating this tension throughout. First of all, by looking, and in particular, the chapter, I think it's chapter 3, that discusses the period after Timur, or between Timur and the Timurids, as a case in which the political center has shattered. We see the emergence of all these regional powers, in the Deccan, as always, its own trajectory, so it started earlier, but later we see it in Hindustan, in Gujarat, in Bengal, in Kashmir, which is, again, wonderful contribution to draw Kashmir into the history of South Asia. Kashmir is so often kind of shunned or pushed aside. And to look how this process of regionalization and in process with the emergence of the vernacular in forms of identity, as well as political structures, how it worked. Now, this allows also to look quite comparatively at the process of Persianization in the regions that did not act in the same way. Kashmir is very different from Bengal, and the Deccan, as always, it's its own thing. So in that sense, I think that presenting the large picture of South Asian history as this kind of, to borrow the wonderful term, although slightly differently in context from Muzaffar Alam and Sanjay Subramanian, the patchwork quilt that is the history of India, not only in the Mughal context, but generally speaking, is very helpful to understand this kind of tension and the fact that we have the powers that unite everything and we can talk comparatively, but we have to remember this region as a central issue. But this brings me to a few questions that I would like to raise here about the relationship between, or the role of the Persianate world and process of Persianization in this large picture. So first of all, the book emphasizes the impact of the Persianate world in India in so many respects, from military and cultural to political to religious, of course, and highlights some of the fields in which local production, including vernacular, were influenced by ideas, practices, aesthetics. And this is my first question to you, Richard. In your view, is it a one-way kind of affair that we can see let's say, the spread or the absorption of ideas from this Persianate world into India? Or do you think that we have an element of, let's say, mutual interaction? So do you think that Persian itself changed due to this difference? Now, you do mention the translations a little bit from Sanskrit to Persian. And I want to mention in this context the recent book by Emma Flatt, who shows this kind of interaction. But to a large degree, both these works look at works in Persian that try to find quite a lot of similarity in perceptions between those worlds. But can we see, or can we trace actual changes in the way that Persian expressed its ideas or thoughts in Persian due to the encounter with both the Sanskritic world and the world of the vernaculars? And even more so, can we see an outflow from India into the rest of the Persianate world? The following question I would like to look is pushing on my point earlier about regional variation. And of course, I want to look at the Deccan region that we both share a lot of fondness to, and this is the right platform to raise this question. The Deccan has another complication to the story that we don't have, let's say, in Bengal or Gujarat, in which we have the Sanskritic world and we have one dominant vernacular, in addition to Persian. In the Deccan, we have the unresolved issue of Dakhani culture as kind of a place that absorbs much of those influences of both vernacular and Persianate. And then we have the three vernaculars, which, and we discussed it elsewhere, do not map necessarily very nicely into the cases, the way that in Golconda we have this affiliation with Telugu, in Ahmednagar we have the affiliation in Marathi. In Bijapur it's not completely working. And how do you think that this kind of multi-directional influence or vectors work to create a courtly culture in a way that would be different from Bengal? The third question, and I will finish there, is you started your presentation here from rejecting the narrative of conflict, which I think that many of us will share the sentiment with you, of course, that the narrative as it is presented for political purposes in India, not only today, but for the recent 2 centuries, is highly problematic, and the evidence really talks about a completely different universe than this conflict. But do you think that there is a place in which the conflict did play some role in this interaction? So is it only some kind of cultural inflow or assimilation, or do you think that there was a conflicted element to this interaction that at certain places and certain times may have been expressed publicly? I think that I'll finish.
Okay, thank you so much, Roy, for that very in-depth look at the book. Professor Eaton, would you like to respond?
Well, thank you, Roy. Excellent questions, all of them. Actually, I counted 4 questions. It's not 3.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, because you raised the question of the tension between metropolitan and periphery. Well, you didn't use the word periphery, or maybe regional. But yes, I mean, I agree that there is always that tension between metropolitan and regional, if we think of it as in a spatial sense. And I talk about that very specifically with respect to the edges of the Mughal Empire and how that kind of works in areas like Bengal or Punjab. But there's another kind of metropolitan and regional that is not really spatial, and that this speaks to the idea of a trans-regional discourse versus any kind of a local one. And it is that precise kind of dialectic that I found the most challenging to write about, because it works itself out very differently in every region. For example, in Kashmir, Kashmiri language never becomes the vernacular. I mean, it is a vernacular language, but it never acquires or attains anything like the status of, say, Telugu literature in Andhra or Bengali literature in the Delta region. But rather, Persian retains its hegemony there. And so you have these different kinds of outcomes in different parts of South Asia, which are endlessly fascinating and endlessly complicated. So that my book, I hope, is no more than kind of pointing out some suggestions as to how other people might want to elaborate or solve some of these riddles. But yeah, so that's that one issue, the tension of trans-regional versus regional is an ongoing thing that cuts through the whole book. Then you raised the question of whether Persianate culture changed in its encounter with India, and that is really a fascinating one that I got to think about, because in one sense it did not, in the sense that there is a consistent and persistent canon of literature which survives all the way down to the present day. You go to if you study Persian literature today at most any university, you will be reading many of the same books that were already the canon as early as the 14th century. And what one can do, and I didn't do this very much in my own book, but it's easy to do, is to actually reconstruct what was the curriculum, what were the books that were frequently used in the madrasas, what were the books that that elites were having their sons read to make them a properly educated person, which is to say, what kind of Persian texts. Certain names always keep popping up. I mean, Hafez, Sadi, obviously Ferdowsi, Shahnameh, Nizami's romances, and so forth. And so to the extent that there is a great deal of continuity and persistence of a canon, I would argue that there is a central core of values which is transmitted across generations and does remain constant. That's not to say, however, that there isn't a great deal of admixture coming from Indian culture. I mean, we see this I mean, consider, for example, the Premakan genre that Aditya Bell studied, how you have a Sufi genre of literature, but it is completely overwhelmed by the Indian atmosphere of the Eastern Gangetic Delta, right, where you have Indian names, Indian flora and fauna, all of that is infiltrating into that genre, so that one can take individual pieces of Persianate culture and see how there is indeed a great deal of influence coming in. Where I thought you were going with that question was whether or not the transmission of Sanskritic culture out of India came anywhere near the extent as the opposite, which is Persian culture into India. You didn't quite go there, but I'm going to answer it anyway, because one of the fascinating things that I discovered, and I've always wondered why it was that the overall exchange between the Iranian plateau and Central Asia on the one hand and the subcontinent on the other is that the overwhelming degree of culture always goes from the former to the latter and not the other way around. You know, I lived in Iran for a couple of years, and you're hard pressed to see much of that happening, apart from the well-known instances of, you know, works of literature which made it from even in the Sasanian period, long before the Turkish period of time. There is always that, but by and large, the overwhelming flow of culture is from west to east, not the other way around. Your question about the Deccan being more complicated than other regions, and you're quite right about that. And where does Bijapur fit into that? I will simply appeal to your own book, where I think you rather marvelously and convincingly argue that Bijapur is quite different from either Ahmednagar or Golconda. At least I'm convinced, in the sense that unlike those other two states, which were nested in their respective linguistic zones, right? Telugu for Andhra and Golconda, and Marathi for Ahmednagar. Bijapur is straddling this much larger central zone, and it opts for choosing a kind of imperial, as you argue, and I'm convinced it's true. In fact, it's illustrated by the fact the amount of Chalukya material evidence we find in Bijapur, and we do not find that in Golconda. We do not find that in Ahmednagar. So that is, by way of answering your question, yes, that is how I see Bijapur is different, and you're the one who kind of awakened me to that possibility and looking at it from that perspective. Finally, you raised the question of religious conflict. Was it there at all? And does it compare with the modern era? That's a very, very important question, because people are oftentimes tempted to simply project backwards 19th century or 20th century realities onto the pre-modern past. You know, I mean, it's even gotten to the point where Muhammad bin Qasim, the Arab conqueror of Sind in the 8th century has been in some Pakistani textbooks described as the first citizen of Pakistan, which is wildly anachronistic. So having said that, it's certainly true that Muslims knew they were Muslims and non-Muslims knew they were non-Muslims. You don't have to look very far to see the whole discourse of kafirs and Musulman in Persian literature. It's definitely there. Alterity is there. Difference is there. And people are negotiating that all the time. But the difference, it seems to me, the critical difference between pre-modern South Asia and modern South Asia is the idea of the public sphere that Habermas developed. It really is only when you have newspapers and radio that people are suddenly alerted to the fact that they are part, that their little village is really part of a subcontinent-wide society, and that you only get communal conflict once there is this idea that it's not, we're not just in some isolated village, but rather we are participating in a broader community, which covers the whole of South Asia, and the idea of a public sphere simply did not exist in the pre-modern era. You do not have newspapers, you do not have radio, you do not have TikTok and Instagram and all the stuff that we have that constantly reminds us that we are part of a huge community. That did not exist then, and that is, I think, the critical point distinguishing our modern period from pre-modern Indian history, where yes, you do have alterity, you have difference, those differences are negotiated, but you do not find anything like 19th century communal conflicts. They simply are not there, and that's what needs to be explained. So yes, so I'll stop there.
So thank you so much. We have a lot of questions coming in, and I'm not really sure whether we're going to have time to get to even half of them. But I also know that Dr. Filon has things to say as well, but I actually want to take my license as a moderator here to follow up actually on something that Roy said, which is, this question of whether or not India or South Asia or Hindustan or the Deccan changed Persianate culture in any way. And when you look at the manuscript record, right, and you look at how the Shahnama or the Gulistan or any of these very classic texts are remade over and over again, they really take on different lives. So for us to say that, India is contributing to this culture, it really becomes a center in many ways. If you look at, what's happening in Persian lexicography, for instance, I think of Rajiv Kinra's work, and I think about the fact that India is the center of Persian lexicography from a very early period. So for us to say that, to even ask the question, is it changing the state of Persianate culture? It is Persian culture. So for me, I think we really need to maybe, of course, it's very sticky when we have these two sort of overlapping, cosmopolises, as you put it, to sort of tease out how it becomes a center. But I think one of the really big services that your book does is actually say that it is becoming Persianate culture. There's not the idea of what it changes it's a much longer trajectory. And I mean, there's always this assumption that, the Gulistan or these texts, they remain stagnant, they don't change, but they change. Their interpretations and how they're instrumentalized in society it changes considerably over time. And I think that that's something that we need to keep in mind. And the work of Emma Flatt also tells us, I mean, it's very instructive in that regard, in how these texts change over time and their interpretations. So on that note, if you have anything to respond to that, we're happy to take it. But
I totally agree with you.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you.
It's a very good point. That really is a good point.
Yeah.
Just a quick response to that. It's a very good point, and yet the question is flowing back out of India to the Ottoman Empire or to Central Asia or to Iran, or did the altered Persianate culture as the center developed in India remained in India? And that's a big difference.
I mean, I think it's an open question, but I think, you know, there is a long history of reception of South Asia in these other places that is important to engage with. But I know that Helen, Dr. Phelan, also has a question that is important to ask. Helen?
Yes, no, I think that what Vivek said is quite right. I think Persianate culture in the Deccan is definitely transformed. You look, I mean, I deal more with architecture rather than manuscripts, and this is evident in almost all the buildings that we have, where in fact the influence from Iran is really interpreted in a totally different way. But what I wanted to ask you, Richard, is totally based, you know, it's basic if you want. Could you, I mean, and it's more something that interests me. It has to do with the Bahmanis, of course. What else? And I wanted to ask whether you could consider Gizudaraz belonging to the Persianate or the vernacular of the Deccan.
Well, he's right. You're making it either or, which is very difficult.
Yes, I know.
I have to decide.
I thought make it more difficult for you.
He certainly brings with him from north. I mean, after all, he's born in the Deccan.
Yeah.
Goes north, and then he comes back home, of course. But he brings with him this northern tradition of Chishti Sufi thought, and one could say that he serves to transplant that right in the heart of the Deccan Plateau. And he's certainly Persian in that sense, and he writes in Persian.
But he also writes Deccani. He also
there's Deccani that's attributed to him, but I have never been convinced that that is authentic. But it does have to be said that there is enormous Deccani literature. I mean, literature about Gizudaraz in Deccani, which is written by followers and indeed his own progeny in the Deccan. So that I would say that the life of Gizudaraz becomes indigenized over time, very, very profoundly, very deeply. And to that extent, yes, there's a if you introduce the element of time to it, I think that you can say that there is an increasing Deccanization of Gizudaraz as a persona. If we just look at the extraordinary amount of Deccani literature, folk literature, that survives in places like the Salajangi Museum in Hyderabad, that goes on. So that, yes, that's how I would think about that question.
But can I ask, the fact that the Shishti silsila is basically a silsila that follows the philosophy of Ibn Arabi, and Gizudaraz, when he arrives in the Deccan, he introduces a philosophy that questions the Wujudi beliefs and introduces his own. He does it for political reasons. He does it because he wants to control, he wants to create a counterpower, you know, against the one that Firuz Shah had established. I mean, he's beginning to play a political role. I mean, he seems to have many more duties, quote unquote, than a Sufi would have so obviously, you know.
That's quite true. And of course, the difficulty he got into with Firuz illustrates exactly your point, that he became the center of a political controversy.
Okay.
But it was more than political. You're quite right. It's theological. The influence of Ibn Arabi and the introduction of Ibn Arabi's thought and the challenging of that at the court, and the fear that Gizudaraz was diffusing, was teaching, you know, the Wahdat al-Wujud kind of thing. that is part of it. So it was a political as well as theological problem that he had.
So, Professor Eaton, thank you so much. I don't think we're going to have time to answer any of these great questions because we are just really running over time right now. We're 20 minutes over time, but I do want to close again, sorry, a bit selfishly, to ask you one question about your book. Final question about your book is, I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the stakes of writing a book on the Persianate Age in South Asia, when the majority of Muslims in South Asia today don't necessarily see themselves as Persianate. They see themselves as Muslims. And, you know, and I think that's a very important thing to think about when the politics of publishing a book like this, you know, and I understand that it's coming from the point of view of a historian, but we also need to think about the contemporary world and society today, because I think this type of book it can be mobilized in many ways, and this history can be mobilized in many ways. And of course, you know, somebody with the name Vivek Gupta can go in and see, oh, I belong to a Persianate world, but what about someone with another name? How did they? I'm just trying to understand your point of view on this subject. Why India and why Persianate? Why not South Asia and why not Islamicate?
Well, India, because that's a word after all that, I mean, yeah, why not South Asia? Well, South Asia is a rather abstract, dry, strictly geographical designation, whereas the word India is something that obviously precedes the Delhi Sultanate. And it is a region that is understood. It's a Greek word after all. I mean, it just means the area beyond the Indus River. So in that sense, it's a rather neutral term. It becomes politicized, obviously, only in the 20th century, in the sense that we have obviously a Republic of India. But when you're talking about the pre-modern period, it doesn't seem to me that presents any kind of real problem. But what is more germane is your point about where religion does fit into all this. I'm much conscious of the fact that the India that I describe, ending in the late 18th century, is very, very different from the India, or indeed the South Asia of today. And it's precisely that difference with which I open the book, talking about the very, very fact that that religion has been made into this enormously central theme, which I think has been hugely exaggerated and overblown, and is perhaps not even all that relevant when we're speaking of the pre-modern era. Historians are trained to try to situate the past in the past. We all live in the present, and we're not going to get out of the 21st century. We live in this time. So it's a great temptation to read history backwards. But in a nutshell, the problem to me has been that ever since the partition of 1947, there has been a powerful tendency of South Asians, whether they're Muslims in the West or Hindus in India itself, to read history backwards, to justify the partition in terms of a particular understanding of the past, as if all of the past history of South Asia was simply a prologue to 1947 and the partition. That clearly was not the case. So our challenge as historians is to overcome that presentist situation in which we find ourselves, and to try to understand the past on its own terms and not simply as a prologue to our reality.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Dr. Phelan.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I thank Alka and Roy for your wonderful points and the problems that we will definitely think about for a very long time. Thank you really very much. It was a wonderful interaction today. Thank you.
Great
you can find, if you want to learn what our next webinars are, you can go to the DHF site and click on events, and you'll find all the answers that you might require. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.